Week 11. The 11th week began with land still visible, not close enough to reach, not close enough to feel, but close enough to believe that survival had become something more than hope. The coastline had grown sharper overnight, its shape no longer a vague smear on the horizon, but a real and rising edge of a new world. The passengers no longer spoke of America as an idea. They spoke of it as distance measured in hours, not weeks, not days, hours. Yet the ship itself had not forgotten what it was carrying. Below deck, sickness still lingered in pockets of the hold. Some passengers had recovered enough to sit upright again, but others had worsened as the journey neared its end. Exhaustion, hunger, and fever had stripped many of the remaining emigrants down to shadows of what they had been when they left Ireland. The ship that had once carried over 300 souls now carried something far more fragile, a census waiting to be taken. On Monday morning, the captain ordered a full count, not just of passengers, but of condition. The ship was approaching quarantine waters, and American authorities would demand clarity before allowing anyone on shore. A senior sailor moved through the hold with a ledger and a steady but weary expression. He was accompanied by the ship's surgeon, whose presence alone told passengers this was not routine accounting. Michael noticed how carefully they moved between the berths, as if afraid of what they might find, or what they already knew they would find. The count began at the forward hold. Families were grouped together where possible. Each name was read aloud, each response noted. Those too weak to answer were marked with a simple symbol in the ledger. A second symbol indicated illness, a third inability to stand, and a fourth death. There was no ceremony in the system, only record. When they reached the O'Sullivan berth, the sailor paused slightly. He already knew their story. Everyone aboard did. Mary sat upright beside Michael, though her strength had been reduced to little more than presence. Brandon stood beside her. Sean clung quietly to his father's sleeve. The sailor read their names. Michael O'Sullivan, Mary O'Sullivan, Brandon O'Sullivan, Sean O'Sullivan. There was a pause. Number of dependents? The surgeon asked quietly. 4, the sailor replied. The surgeon made a mark in the ledger, then looked at Mary. Her face was drawn but alert. Brandon was thin but steady. Sean appeared tired but upright. All fit for landfall processing, the surgeon said. The words carried weight none of them fully yet understood, but they would, soon. Further down the hold, the categories became more difficult. Passengers were divided into 3 groups, those fit to disembark, those requiring observation, and those requiring immediate medical quarantine. The last group had grown larger than anyone wished to admit. Some suffered from lingering fevers, others from severe weakness. A few were unconscious and could not be moved without assistance. The surgeon did not linger over these classifications, but Michael noticed the hesitation in his movements. Each entry in the ledger represented not just a condition, but a future outcome beyond the ship, or the absence of one. By mid-afternoon the count was complete. The final numbers were read aloud on deck. There was no celebration, only silence as the truth settled over the ship like mist. Fewer than half of those who had originally embarked remained alive. Of those, a portion were deemed fit to enter the United States immediately. Another portion would require quarantine and inspection upon arrival. The remainder were too ill to move freely and would be separated for medical observation, or worse. No one spoke the word lost, but everyone understood its meaning. That evening, the horizon changed again, not land this time, but structure. As dusk fell, a faint outline emerged through the haze, buildings, masts, smoke rising from chimneys, a city growing out of water and light, and then the harbour itself came into view, New York. The ship slowed as it entered the approaches. The water became calmer, more controlled, as though even the ocean here had learned discipline. Then, rising in the distance like a gateway to another life, stood Ellis Island, small, functional, unimposing, and yet to every soul aboard it represented something larger than anything they had ever seen. Judgment, admission, possibility. For several minutes no one spoke. Even the most exhausted passengers found the strength to stand. Mary gripped Michael's arms tightly. Brandon stared as though afraid to blink. Sean whispered, "We're really here." Michael nodded, but didn't trust his voice. As the ship advanced slowly towards the harbour, the reality of arrival began to replace the dream of it. Men on shore could already be seen preparing boats. Officials, doctors, inspectors. The final gate between suffering and survival was not land itself, but permission to step onto it. On deck, the surgeon closed his ledger. He looked towards the crowded ship, towards the exhausted faces, watching the city grow larger with every passing minute. Then he said quietly to the captain, "We'll lose more in the process." The captain didn't ask who, he already knew. "Prepare the lists," he said. That night the ship anchored at the edge of New York Harbour. The city lights reflected across the water like scattered stars. Ellis Island stood nearby, lit faintly in the darkness, waiting. Some passengers wept openly. Others simply stared in silence, unable to process that the journey had actually ended. But not the ordeal, not yet. Michael stood at the rail long after the others had gone below. The wind had changed. It no longer carried the loneliness of the Atlantic. It carried noise. City sounds, drifting faintly across the water. He thought of Ireland, of the famine, of the children they had lost, of the ship they had watched sink, of the weeks of suffering behind them. Then he looked at the lights of New York and understood something he had not allowed himself to believe until this moment. They had survived the ocean, but survival, he realized, was not the same as arrival. Tomorrow they would face the final judgment of their journey, and the last chapter of their crossing had not yet been written. Week 12. The 12th week began in sight of land that no longer felt like hope. It felt like waiting. The ship lay at anchor in New York Harbour, close enough now that the city was no longer a shape on the horizon, but a living presence. Smoke, noise, movement, and constant motion that seemed impossible after the endless silence of the Atlantic. Ellis Island stood nearby like a gate that did not open freely but examined everything that approached it. For the passengers aboard the old emigrant vessel, the journey hadn't ended, it had simply changed form. At dawn, the first boats came. Uniformed officials, doctors, and the inspectors rowed out to the ship. Their arrival was efficient, practiced, and without ceremony. They boarded in groups, carrying ledgers, medical instruments, and lists that had already been partially prepared during the night. The process began immediately. No one was allowed ashore yet, not until they were examined, not until they were classified, not until they were judged fit to enter. Passengers were called in order. Families were separated temporarily into lines that snaked across the deck. Michael held Mary's hand tightly as they were instructed to step forward. Brandon stayed close to his father. Sean clung to Mary's skirt. All four of them were unrecognizable compared to the people who had boarded in County Kerry. Their clothes hung loosely on gaunt bodies. Their faces were hollowed by weeks of hunger, exhaustion, and grief, yet they stood, and that for now was enough. Medical inspections were swift but thorough. Eyes were checked, fever was tested, bodies were examined for signs of contagious illness. Those who showed no obvious symptoms were marked as cleared for entry. Those who were weak but stable were marked for secondary observation. Those who were visibly ill were removed from the main line. Quietly, without argument, without exception, a separate boat waited for them. Michael saw them being led away. Some could walk unaided, others were carried. A few didn't move at all. Mary noticed his gaze and said nothing. There was nothing left in her to question the system, only to endure it. Brandon watched silently, understanding more than he should ever have been able to at his age. Sean asked once in a whisper, "Where are they going?" Michael didn't answer immediately, and when he did, his voice was low. "I don't know." But he did know, everyone knew. They were being taken away from the promise of America, into quarantine, into separation, into uncertainty that few would ever speak of again. Hours passed, names were called, lists were checked, marks were made. The O'Sullivan family waited through it all, and at one point Mary nearly collapsed from exhaustion and had to be steadied by Michael and Brandon together. The surgeon who had accompanied them across the Atlantic passed nearby but didn't intervene. He simply looked at them for a moment and then continued on. There was nothing more he could do here. The sea had been his domain, the land had its own rules. By late afternoon, the final group from their ship was processed. Those cleared were instructed to prepare for transfer to shore. Those not cleared were escorted away in smaller boats toward medical facilities on the island. No one waved goodbye. There was no time for it, no structure for it, only movement forward or removal from the line entirely. When the order finally came for the O'Sullivan family to disembark, none of them spoke. They gathered what little remained of their belongings. There was almost nothing left. a few worn garments, a small cloth bundle, the remnants of a journey that had stripped them of nearly everything except each other. They stepped into the waiting boat that would carry them to land. Brandon looked back once at the ship. Sean did not. Mary kept her eyes fixed forward. Michael stood between them all and didn't look back either. Ellis Island was louder than anything they had ever experienced. Voices, footsteps, doors opening and closing, commands shouted in unfamiliar accents. The air itself felt different, thicker, faster, more urgent. Inside the processing halls, lines formed again. Questions were asked, names recorded, histories reduced to paperwork. Michael answered when spoken to. Mary nodded when she could. Brandon and Sean stayed close, overwhelmed but obedient. Hours passed before they were finally told what they'd been waiting to hear. They were admitted. Not fully free, not fully settled, but permitted to enter. Allowed to begin again. Outside, the city of New York stretched endlessly upward and outward, nothing like the world they'd left behind. But none of them had the strength to truly take it in. Mary leaned heavily against Michael as they stepped forward. Brandon and Sean followed. Each step away from the processing hall felt less like arrival and more like survival, continuing in a different form. That night they found themselves among thousands of others, new arrivals, displaced families, exhausted immigrants, all carried forward by the same journey that had brought them across the ocean. There was no celebration, only rest and silence, the silence of bodies that had nothing left to give. In the end, the record of the voyage was written not in the hopes of those who survived, but in the numbers that could be counted. From County Kerry, the ship had departed with 312 souls aboard. Across 12 weeks at sea, through storm, famine, fever, and loss, 187 died at sea. Their names recorded in ship's logs and burial notes, or simply lost to the Atlantic without ceremony. 38 were removed during processing and did not return to the main flow of arrivals, taken instead into quarantine or hospital wards, their ultimate fate unrecorded in the family's knowledge. 87 survived, to be formally admitted into the United States, among them Michael O'Sullivan, Mary O'Sullivan, and their 2 surviving children, Brandon and Sean. What remained of their journey could not be measured in numbers alone. It lived in empty spaces where people had once sat, in the silence where laughter had once briefly returned, in the memory of a child who never saw America at all, and in the knowledge that survival, for those who reached land, did not erase what the sea had taken. It only carried it forward.